Hello again, Colleen Joy. Great to connect with you again in the Wisdom Dialogues with Odyssey Magazine. And the topic I'd like to address today is really not a question, but a perception I have about where we are at as a people in a country right now in terms of the grief that has been suffered through losses. And I feel like we are a country, a community, a populace in mourning. Mourning for that which has passed, perhaps financial loss, job loss, loss of freedom, the inability to go and visit with friends and family, the inability to have proper funerals for loved ones, and a lot of illness and a lot of loss of life due to illness. And so I find we have become a society in constant mourning. And at some point, I feel that we need to find our way out of the mourning and begin to redelight, for want of a better word, in our country, our people, our families, and the world around us. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Deborah. Yes, such a pertinent discussion, and thank you for putting it on the table for us. So something that I actually keep, I don't know if you've ever seen one of those crying Buddhas. It's those little statues that are sometimes carved out of wood. And it's, instead of the Buddha in his happy little smiley face, my great-grandmother, can you believe it, who lived to the age of 99. Her name was Ruby Rose McLean. She inherited from her mother a set of brass Buddhas, and they were Catholics. So this was completely, revolutionary, I suppose, or rebellious. But she had these little brass Buddhas that I grew up with. We used to rub their little tummies. They were the big fat smiley Buddhas with the long ears and the big fat tummies. And so when I saw a Buddha statue that was a crying Buddha, one of those Buddhas with his head in his hands, and I remember thinking to myself, that was odd. It was such a contrast with the happy, smiley Buddha. And it doesn't matter what religious tradition, we have these iconic images of smiley, saint-like, peaceful, and then we also have images of the various human emotions. And this crying Buddha, I keep a statue of that. I also have one of the original statues from my great-grandmother next to my bed. And I like having both to remind me that even the Buddha cries. And I think of also a quote from Nisargadatta, who said, he was that amazing sage and non-dual sage from the Vedanta tradition. And so one of the things that is interesting about his life is that he sold cigarettes his whole life, and was an incredibly clear voice, I feel, for non-duality. And one of his quite famous quotes is, he said, "You cry because you love yourself." And so I think first, as always, is to acknowledge the crying Buddha, to acknowledge we cry because we love ourselves, and not to try and elevate ourselves above the human experience, to be lofty, to be quote unquote, try to be spiritual. That being said, the next, if there is a next, but when it feels natural to look beyond that, when it feels like now we feel we must seek our wisdom, we must look a little bit deeper, I find that resistance is one of the most painful states. In fact, I had a monk friend who's still a friend, but he's no longer a monk, named Radha Krishna, who used to say, all suffering is the avoiding of suffering. And I thought it was so powerful to understand that. So we accept our crying Buddha. We know that we love ourselves enough to grieve, and yes, to be in mourning. And then to sit with the resistance, to sit with the, I don't want things to be this way. And then I find for myself, and it's echoed in many traditions and teachings, is to deeply surrender. Because that resistance, this trying not to suffer, the resistance, this I want it to be some other way, causes me more suffering than the actual moment. So it's a case of finding the courage to surrender to what I cannot change. The beautiful prayer, the wisdom of knowing what we can change from what we can't, and to surrender, to deeply surrender. Instead of I don't want to be in a hospital right now, to surrender to I am in a hospital right now, if that is what is true. Instead of I don't want there to be a lockdown, to surrender to that there is a lockdown. And this surrendering is not a passive, it looks passive, and people, I think, make the mistake of thinking that surrendering is a giving up. No, and I'm going to perhaps tell a story quick. I had a student once who I love dearly, who she was paralyzed from the waist down from an accident. And I remember I used to have a training venue that had stairs, and the first day she came for a class, she didn't want anyone to help her up the stairs. Her legs were in stilts and were kept in a way that she could use crutches, but it was very difficult for her to walk. And she refused everyone's help, and she was quite angry and upset about people wanting to help her up the stairs. As part of what I was teaching that day, we were looking at power versus powerlessness. And we mourn where we've lost power, right? So where we've lost choice, where we've lost freedom. And this is very natural that we mourn this. And she was very upset with me for suggesting that we surrender to what we have no power over. And I remember she told me on the Sunday, because that was a Saturday, and the Sunday she came up to me, she says, Cole, she says, I nearly didn't come back today. She says, you're quite sneaky with all this love. She says, because if you hadn't spoken with such love, it would have been very easy to just not come back. But I'd suggested that we look honestly at and surrender to where we have no power. And she said she went home and she didn't want to accept her paralysis. She didn't want to accept that her legs wouldn't work. She wanted to cling to a little thread of an idea that a miracle would happen, but it had been 2-3 years already. And then she said she surrendered and she cried. She grieved for the loss of her limbs. She grieved for the struggle of her life. And she found deep acceptance. And some interesting things happened, Deborah. On that Sunday, when she faced those same stairs, she let people help her up the stairs. She told me that she'd made friends with her wheelchair. And when I saw her about a year after that, she's a beautiful, radiant, courageous soul, and she'd built a business. She said to me, Colleen, that was the defining moment for her, because once she surrendered to where she had no power, she could then take her energy to where she did have power. She could go to physio, which she had been denying. She could build herself a little business, which she'd been not doing because she was still fighting her paralysis. So I think we may encourage ourselves to find this wisdom of deep surrender for the forces that are bigger than us, the things that truly we have no choice over. I have a little formula that says power equals responsibility plus choice. Where we have power is where we are able to respond, responsibility to the choice that's in front of us. Where we have no power is where we have no choice and are unable to respond. We are therefore not responsible. And that's the place of surrender. So instead of power, we find peace. In that peace, we heal our mourning, and we can reorientate. We find the energy again. We find the life force inside of us to go right. Like my beautiful student who then could build a business and then could go to physio and then could reclaim the life that she had. But it first took deep, courageous surrender.
I think you've answered that question. There's nothing really more I can say. And I think that story is just, it epitomizes what one has to do. It's about that acceptance, about going within and actually using the resources available to you to come out on the other side stronger, more positive, more successful, more orientated. It was a really beautiful story. Thank you for that, Colleen Joy. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Stay blessed.
Thank you so much.